Wolong Fallen Dynasty is a new Souls-like adventure from developer Team Ninja, a spiritual successor to Neo 1 and 2, if you will, with a dark fantasy twist on Chinese mythology. And, once again, the learning curve is formidable. In fact, the very first boss, within 20 minutes of play, sets an incredibly high standard of difficulty. It's a barrier to any progress until you truly learn Wolong's mechanics. The key lesson being understanding the importance of dodging and countering. Dodging an enemy's strike, especially a special move signified by a red glow, gives you a huge advantage. It opens foes up to a powerful counter, altering the stats between you and the enemy in the process, and in doing so, the fortunes of war swing in your favour. Wolong is also a game heavily structured around these boss encounters, in a similar vein to From Software's work on Sekiro. It's a successive line of new challenges, connected by linear pathways in between, where the satisfaction is in learning each one's attack patterns, their rhythm, and how to open each one up to a final lethal blow. And once you do finally break through boss number 1 here, after hours of trying in my case, the rest of the game suddenly clicks into place.
Don't be so cocky.
That's the gameplay in a nutshell, but what of the technology? Well, where to start? Team Ninja's most recent work was, of course, 2022's Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, which released on all PlayStation and Xbox consoles last and current gen, and PC of course. And that multi-platform approach follows for Wolong as well. For better or worse, Team Ninja's underlying tech has similar characteristics here. We have PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, S, and even the older Xbox One and PS4 machines in the running for today's tech breakdown. So to my count, that's 7 consoles in total, and bearing in mind the newer generation of consoles offer 2 modes apiece, a performance mode and a resolution mode, there's a total of 11 ways to play. But as you'll see, the preference is pretty clear. So is it as simple as recommending PS5 or Series X and just leaving it there, or is the Series S version viable as a 60fps experience? How drastic are the visual cutbacks between Series S and X? And indeed, looking back to the older PS4 and Xbox One systems, how deep do the compromises run there? Let's find out. Okay, to the basics. Both PS5 and Series X offer a performance mode, which runs at 60fps, and also a resolution mode, which also runs at 60fps. Essentially, both have uncapped frame rates, though the former locks to 60fps better than the latter. The key difference between the two modes is in the resolution target though. Textures, shadows, grass density, the pop-in, it's all the same regardless of which you choose, but from pixel counting each, we typically get a native 2240 by 1260 in the performance mode on both PS5 and Series X. DRS might be in effect, but it rarely adjusts from 1260p in my experience. And then, switching to the resolution mode, we get a higher, native 1440p on both consoles. Honestly, it's not a drastic visual difference between the two modes, and the bottom line is the drop to 1260p in the performance modes helps each console zero in on a tighter 60fps lock, which we'll get to later on. And, as a side note, there's no difference otherwise between PS5 and Series X in visual settings, regardless of which mode you use. Jumping over to Series S next, this again is a 2-mode situation. Unlike the premium consoles though, Series S's modes actually do affect the frame rate. Resolution mode, for example, renders at 900p at 30 frames per second, albeit with uneven frame pacing. Unfortunate, but more on that later. And meanwhile, the performance mode appears to target 60fps, but oddly enough sticks with 900p as the resolution as well. The good news is Series S really does a respectable job of hitting 60 in its performance mode, but yes, the resolution target is seemingly identical either way, 900p in both modes from my testing so far. Possibly dynamic scaling might be a factor here, in that DRS may be more aggressively deployed to help performance mode hit 60fps, but the resolution counts don't deviate drastically in my experience. Either way, on the surface, Series S hasn't turned out too badly, except you may have noticed, the cutbacks to its core visual settings are often quite striking. Textures, shadows, and even the cloth physics are all downgraded on Series S. And so, putting the 60fps mode aside, this places Series S's visuals more in line with a last-gen experience. Let's run through the downgrades in order. The texture mapping on Series S is an obvious one. Materials for mountain walls, rocks, mossy terrain, it's all substituted for lower quality assets. Not that Series X's setting is particularly glamorous by any stretch, but somehow Series S undercuts it with an even lower preset. And that's really not the worst of it. Shadow detailing is removed from the scenery to an extent, transparency effects like fire take a nosedive in resolution too, quite visibly in fact across this opening besieged village. Honestly, you'll spot it right away even without Series X for reference. And likewise, sprite work used for plants on the ground are not only lowered in quality, but also their density all round on Series S. So a camera pan around this training area reveals a plainer, less richly detailed environment for the 4 teraflop machine on left. It's quite sobering to see that, even on its 30fps resolution mode, there's no workaround. These settings stay in place regardless of which mode you use on Series S, performance or resolution, so you're stuck. Keeping with Series S, there's even more downgrades to cover. Draw distances for grass are further afield from the player on Series S, though geometry and shadows draw in at a similar range to be fair. So, more obvious pop-in essentially. Perhaps more surprisingly though, is that cloth physics are significantly dialed back. The flag checkpoints, for example, dynamically billow to the wind on Series X and PS5, but on Series S, that's relegated to a basic, scripted motion. Looking closer, even decorative cloth elements across this desert valley area stays largely static on Series S. It strips this whole area of some much needed movement, some energy, and again, this all matches the last-gen console setups. Even the motion blur is downgraded. If we freeze frame during a cutscene, you'll see more dithering to movement with the Series S release. A shame to see all round then, especially given that even Series S's 30fps resolution mode doesn't partition at least some GPU power to boost its visuals. The gut reaction, Series S resorts to settings closer to the last-gen versions, and that gut reaction isn't totally far off. What we actually have on base PS4 or Xbox One though is somehow still a step behind the Series S release. So let's see the situation here. The resolution and framerate stats I'll summarize very quickly. Now, all 4 older consoles from PS4 to PS4 Pro, Xbox One to One X run at 30fps with uneven frame pacing and no mode toggle for 60fps as on newer consoles. In terms of image quality, both PS4 Pro and Xbox One X render at a 1920 by 1080 resolution, typically just 1080p, which is already higher than Series S's 900p. Meanwhile, the base PS4 targets just 1280 by 720, 720p, using this boss sequence as a quick test. And lastly, Xbox One S renders this scene at an even lower 1152 by 648 figure. Again though, amazingly, all 4 run at a mostly locked 30fps, even with bursts of these fluctuating frame times. It never feels smooth in action as a result, no matter which you pick, but genuine drops under 30fps are surprisingly rare in my experience. Still, the fact resolutions are scaled back so aggressively, especially in the base PS4 or Xbox One's case, it means the game never produces a particularly flattering image. Let's see the extremes in comparison, base PS4 versus PS5 to start, to show how Team Ninja's engine scales. The most obvious change is the halving of its frame rate to 30fps with uneven frame pacing on PS4. I'll be honest, jumping from PS5, which I started on, to the PS4 version, this drop in frame rate is felt immediately in the gameplay, and Wolong simply feels less enjoyable to play as a result. And that goes for PS4 Pro as well, which is also capped at 30. And then there's the visual stuff, the lower grade materials for skin, terrain, and the effects too, plus of course the sparser layout for foliage, the missing cloth physics. It all stacks up to a lesser image on older PS4 consoles. And swapping to the Xbox side, in a 4-way split showing Xbox One, One X, Series S, and Series X, yes, interestingly, even a powerful mid-gen refresh console like the One X doesn't push for higher settings. The basic One S model prunes back foliage further than the other consoles in the quartet, But to get the high-grade textures, effects, and cloth physics, well, even the Series S and One X don't qualify for those. For that, you simply have to buy a Series X to get this higher rung of visual quality. To the performance testing next, and starting with the resolution mode on PS5, the outlook is promising to start. Exploration and even small battles generally hit 60 FPS without any issue at a native 1440p, but, and this is the catch, there's seemingly no GPU headroom here to factor in any more lavish effects work. The fire spells, the terraforming moves, it all triggers drops well into the 50 FPS region and at times pushes PS5 into the 40s. Especially so, I've noticed, when you deliver a successful counter, which is a pretty regular gameplay occurrence. And honestly, this is just the start of the game, the opening 2 to 3 hours and the first 3 bosses, so I really do wonder how later enemies, later weapons and later skill unlocks might push the machine harder. In reality then, this resolution mode has a range of 50 to 60 FPS in battles for PS5, sometimes spiking down to 40 FPS, and also, regardless of whether you use this mode or the performance mode, all the cutscenes cap at 30 FPS anyway, with uneven frame pacing. Jumping over to Xbox Series X in its own resolution mode, it's a similar situation. We get 50 to 60 FPS in battles, with abrupt drops beneath that range, while exploration tends to unfold at 60 FPS. Actually, there's evidence to suggest Series X is at least marginally smoother than PS5, so check this out. Looking at this patch of flames, and being stood in exactly the same spot, Series X's resolution mode gives us a flat reading of 54 to 55 FPS, but switching to PS5, that drops to between 52 and 53 FPS. A small margin I realise, but worth a mention since, again, all gameplay is impossible to sync for like comparisons. Still, this lays out the situation clearly enough. They're close, and fundamentally, to get the most out of Series X and PS5 on this 1440p resolution mode, you'll ideally need a variable refresh rate display. VRR support will go a long way to smooth over these irregular frame rates. If you want to squeeze more pixels from each machine, that's at least one way to adjust. But to be frank, I just don't think it's a worthwhile trade for most people when the performance mode at 1260p delivers a much better balanced 60 FPS. Switching over to the performance mode then, yes, both PS5 and Series X deliver a drastically cleaned up 60 FPS line. Case in point, toggling the performance mode on during this fiery stress point solves the issue right away. It justifies the drop to 1260p in my view, and it becomes a straight 60 FPS line. Okay, it's not perfect in battles later on, but close enough to 60 that you benefit from some consistency when timing a dodge. The most typical drops manifest as the spikes down to 55 FPS or so, just as major attacks land, and the worst case, possibly the most extreme one I've found, is just under the 50 FPS line for a second as we land our counter. It's hardly ideal, but then PS5 and Series X alike benefit from the performance mode right from the get-go. Not much more to say on this one honestly, except that it's an easy one to recommend. The state of Xbox Series S, meanwhile, even with its cutbacks in visual quality, is surprisingly robust. I'll say up front that there's no real upside to running on its 30 FPS resolution mode here. You just get a locked, if unevenly frame-paced 30 FPS line across the game, and for little benefit. The frame pacing is too erratic, and actually quite reminiscent of From Software's Bloodborne. At least the fact we have an option to go to 60 FPS is a huge benefit all round, and there's no catch otherwise. Switching to the 60 FPS performance mode here, the frame rate level is broadly speaking on par with PS5 and Series X's. Wolong runs at a mostly solid 60 FPS with similar spikes to 55 FPS and sometimes under during big attacks. It's not perfect, but again, the upshot is the decision is pretty easy to make when faced with that mode toggle on Series S. Just leave it at 60 FPS on the performance mode, set and forget and enjoy, even if Series S's visual cutbacks to achieve 60 FPS do seem quite excessive. Any tech review verdict of Wolong Fallen Dynasty must recognise the fact that this is not a polished, finished article. In my time playing, I've spotted visual bugs like flickering shadows on Xbox consoles, old and new. I've seen one colossally large freeze to gameplay on Series X as well, which thankfully righted itself after a few seconds. Also distracting is the often absent shadow maps, entire chunks of terrain, grass, upper reft of shadow, and even ambient occlusion. Even on PS5 and Series X, the best case turnout hardly screams next-gen at you. In both cases, it has the look and feel of a last-gen project running at 60 FPS, though of course with SSDs inside each, the loading times are admittedly much better for fast travel or respawning than PS4 or Xbox One. After recently covering Wild Hearts, another Koei Tecmo-produced title, albeit from a different developer, it's hard to shake off a sense of deja vu here. Both Wolong and Wild Hearts are, honestly, a ton of fun. Genuinely well-designed games in each their own right, mechanically speaking, with tight combat, intriguing settings, even if they both take heavy inspiration from elsewhere. Their art direction is superb, and I'd recommend both. But here's the catch, without a firm technical delivery behind them, and in Wolong's case, without an evenly paced 30 FPS cap on last gen, with the hugely pared back visuals on Series S, any recommendation here must have an asterisk attached to it. The best way to play these games on console is obviously PS5 or Series X. It's unsurprising to say, for 60 FPS alone, these consoles are the ones to go for, but I really wish the quality of experience on Team Ninja's engine scaled down better to the other consoles. That's all from me today though. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.